A terrible tragedy has taken place in Johannesburg, South Africa, where a building fire has killed 74 people. Now, this building was one of the unregulated abandoned buildings, often referred to as hijacked buildings, meaning that the landlords or the owners of the building were unable to turn any kind of profit from it, so end up just abandoning it. And then often people end up squatting inside of these buildings. Now, sometimes gangs do take over the building and then start charging people rent in order to live there. And this is frequently used to justify a lot of the violent repression against such communities who often do happen to be migrant laborers coming in from other African countries. Now, this fire occurred because essentially there's no building regulation whatsoever because the government isn't even monitoring it. And in fact, previous mayors of the city are responsible for not even having any significant codes whatsoever for the construction of these buildings. So naturally, in a situation like this with immense poverty, which is why people are squatting in this building to begin with, there are going to be accidents like this which create tremendous fires that killed these 74 people. But what is more interesting and what is probably more relevant to this particular video is what certain forces inside the country are actually blaming this incident on. Now, many of them do correctly blame the overwhelming poverty inside of Johannesburg as well as the rest of South Africa. But there is one person in particular who went on CNN to essentially blame China for this incident.
I agree with you. The government's economic policies have failed completely. Our railway infrastructure is in a complete shambles because there is no investment in the railways. So we cannot take our minerals like coal, like iron ore, like manganese ore to international markets, which is why there is so much unemployment. The present government, it adopted policies 25 years ago that led to the deindustrialization of South Africa. It opened up the economy without recapitalizing our industry. The consequence of that is that our manufacturing industry was decimated by imports from Asia. Now that is economic policy. So you cannot say it will take a long time. It was a deliberate economic policy of trying to deliver cheap goods to the voters for the present government, but this was at the expense of growing the economy. They delivered cheap goods by importing from Asia instead of restructuring our manufacturing sector, which admittedly had been protected under big tariff barriers during the apartheid era. But they had to restructure and gradually open the economy up. Instead of doing that, they opened the economy instantly. Yeah. Our manufacturing sector was wiped out, and these are the consequences that you are seeing today.
Now, this was the best recording of this interview that I could find. I watched it live on CNN and decided to reply to it, so when I went to Quest Means Business, I went to their YouTube channel, to CNN, etc., to try to find the original copy, but both of them had been edited to exclude the name of China. But that is who this guest directly blamed by name, which I can't find the original footage of. But it's interesting, I hadn't thought of actually blaming China for what policies that South Africa tended to implement, particularly the long-standing inequality and poverty that was created by apartheid, which China is certainly not responsible for. Now, essentially, what authorities usually like to do in this situation is immediately point to gangs and blame them for this. Oh, it's the gang-occupied building that caused this because of the poverty. The gangs are taking over and doing this. They're not, not properly regulating the building or what it is that they expected gangs to do. This problem literally exists only because of poverty itself. Now you can go into a great amount of detail as to why South Africa is so tremendously poor, particularly the black population. But I think that would be kind of really obvious at this point why the legacy of apartheid leads to so much black poverty. What is important to note here is that, well, it's not actually China's fault. You see, China just offered their goods and services on the world market like everybody else. And they were able to undercut everybody else because of their cost of labor. Usually to the point of things like suicide nets around Foxconn, which Dengists are very happy to defend for some reason. Now, there was no capital reinvestment into much of the railway infrastructure inside of apartheid South Africa for a multitude of reasons, like many of the companies pulling out once apartheid was over, or many of those companies now no longer being able to be globally competitive because they didn't have the apartheid system of basically slave labor in order to produce whatever particular mineral or whatever finished good they were producing. And then this is about the time that China started to come onto the world scene with literally the dirt cheapest labor in the entire world. So it's not simply the government just refused to invest in the railways and then, so naturally all of the minerals are just sitting there on a train somewhere, just not moving. No, that's complete nonsense. It's far more complicated than the guess is trying to make it out to be. The obviously economy is much more complicated than that. It is also very important to note that many companies don't just send manufacturing to China because they're just greedy and want to make more profits. Okay, it's not like really a choice that they make. They're just bad people. And so they do that. They do it because they have to do it. That is the logic of capital. That is a part of the monopoly level of capital that we have today, which has led to largely imperialism. When we do have the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which even Thomas Piketty himself, bourgeois economist, essentially proved was true, and then turned around and said that Marx was wrong because Marx, and then giving no actual real explanation as to why, you do have to alter manufacturing processes to make it more profitable. And guess what? Its variable capital is the one that ended up getting changed. So you send it to cheaper places. You send it to Mexico through the NAFTA agreement. And then when Mexico becomes too expensive or not cheap enough, you've got China to send it to. I mean, when one capitalist does it, they are all going to have to do it, essentially, basically within each individual industry in order to be able to compete with the rest of that industry. If they don't, they're going to fall behind and then go bankrupt, which is why we have less companies producing the same amount of goods today, because capitalism tends towards monopoly, as has been demonstrated not just by Marx, but through many bourgeois economists before him and reality itself. The point to remember here is that it's not just some bad capitalist who made the decision, I'm going to be greedy and send manufacturing somewhere else just so I can make more money. That's not why they do it. They do it because they have to do it. This is the logic and the inevitable result of capitalism itself. The idea that it's just some bad capitalist that does it leaves it open to the false impression that you can just regulate it away. And this is something that both liberals and conservatives are both equally guilty of, because they are not willing to acknowledge this limit of capital. Liberals often say, well, if we just increase the amount of unions in the country, if we just embolden labor, or if we just create new regulation that helps out the working class, then somehow everything will magically work. Or on the conservative side, if we just do our isolationist policies, then we'll bring domestic manufacturing back. Well, no, it won't. Because domestic manufacturing, particularly in the United States, cannot compete with the prices of China, Mexico, Indonesia, Bangladesh, etc. That's the point. They can't compete. And even if you do somehow manage to block them from being able to buy these goods from other countries, eventually that tendency of the rate of profit to fall is still going to completely destroy the profitability of those companies within the United States. Simply just saying, oh, we'll just buy domestically, doesn't work. It doesn't work with manufactured goods. It does work to some degree with heavy industry and to some degree with light industry. But it's not a permanent solution. There is no permanent solution to capitalism. And that's what needs to be recognized here. We can't just regulate away problems, because then we would have done that by now and probably would have done this maybe 2 centuries ago. There is no doing that. It's a repeated cycle of what is essentially libertarian nonsense. Do laissez-faire capitalism, leads to chaos and destruction. Bring in regulation, government oversight, etc. Capitalism still crashes from its own contradictions. Claim real capitalism has never been tried, start laissez-faire capitalism, and then wait for the whole cycle to start all over again while saying real capitalism has never been tried, when in fact it has been tried repeatedly and has been a massive historical failure of repeated crises and destructions, including not only world wars, but, that whole Great Depression thing, and the Great Recession thing, and the failure of capitalist economy every 8 to 10 years called the business cycle. So the point here is to understand that this is not something that just some capitalist does. There is no getting away from this. When you look at how capital accumulates, how it flows, how businesses work, how rates of profit tend to function, this is going to happen. There's no getting away from it. You're not going to regulate this away. Social democracy does not solve this problem, because even social democracies are dependent upon imperialism in order to pay for the benefits and the welfare that they give the people in those countries. And there's no magic solution where everything just suddenly becomes infinite and there's infinite resources out there all of a sudden. Such is complete idealist nonsense. Literally, the term economics means dealing with finite resources, or the science of how to allocate those resources. The idea that there's somehow infinite resources is downright idiocy to even claim such a thing even exists. So there's no getting away from this. This is why capitalism will fail. This is why it repeatedly fails. This is why it's going to drive the entire world off the edge of a cliff through climate change. Because it literally cannot do anything else. It will stop anything that is not profitable. It will do only what is immediately and most profitable to the detriment of everything else, including human life. Which is one of the reasons why South Africa is in the position that it is. There are so many who scratch their heads saying, why didn't the government fix this? Why didn't the government fix that? Exactly what are they supposed to do? You're essentially sitting there saying, why is a system based on inequality not creating equality? It doesn't even make sense on the most basic, most rational level. But that's the point. It is not going to be regulated away. It is not the fault of poor people. It is not the fault of the gangs who are massively overblown as being in control of all these, essentially, squatter apartment blocks or buildings, etc. It's the fault and the very nature of capitalism itself. Capitalism is the problem. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.